Welcome to this chess video, everyone. Here we'll be discussing how to play against White's very common d4 and c4 setup. But if you're a beginning player, we can just avoid all these complications right from the beginning. And even if you're more intermediate to advanced, you might find this really simple system that I'm about to recommend really helpful against that kind of setup. This opening is known as the Nimzo-Indian Defense. So if they start with d4, knight f6, c4, their main setup, then we play e6, not d5, they push their knight, and then we play bishop to b4, pinning this knight. Now, of course, this is a very theoretical main line, as are many others. And if you're just starting out with chess, then really you can pick any main line and study it and get a pretty decent position against the Queen's Gambit. You can accept the Queen's Gambit, you can decline it, you can also play the Slav defense or semi-Slav defense, but there's many options to choose from. And this one I really like because it's very straightforward and simple. And unlike the other main lines that have a ton of theory, you can actually get a really good position if you just understand some of the very key ideas. So what are the main key ideas here? Well, the first main key idea, there's one square of importance I really want to emphasize with this opening. And that square is here, the e4 square. This is the all-important square for both white and black in this opening. Now this knight has less control over this square because the knight is already pinned, but we don't necessarily want to take immediately. Now if they ever provoke our bishop with a move like a3, then it might be valuable to capture this knight, but we tend to wait until they push a3. That way we make them lose an extra tempo by pushing the a pawn. So the normal variation here is for them to play pawn e3. And so for black's setup, and again, I want more so the ideas and not memorizing the exact moves, but what I would recommend here is to play this really cool idea b6. And this is actually kind of more the key of this entire video, where I'm going to show this very, very common plan. Now, very often we will take this knight and give white doubled c-pawns. So when they have these doubled pawns, our plan is actually very straightforward. We want to add pressure to their doubled pawns, especially this pawn on c4. And how we do that is usually playing the move c5 to first fix this weakness here. And then after that, we'll usually be playing this knight here to c6, here to a5, adding pressure to c4, and possibly the bishop will also put pressure on the c4 pawn. Now this is something that's very easy to see when we have examples like we'll show. So after b6, very common, they'll probably play moves like bishop to d3, just developing their bishop. We can fianchetto the bishop. You could also delay that a little bit and try and put the bishop on a6, but I like first controlling the long diagonal here and kind of forcing them to develop in a way that we actually want. Again, we're putting valuable pressure on this e4 square with our bishop. As we mentioned, e4 is very important. So now they'll probably want to block with knight to f3, otherwise we would capture their g2 pawn. And so now we can castle. They can castle, and now because they've castled, we no longer have a pin on this knight. So because they've castled, this is a good opportunity to capture this knight and double their pawns. So we'll capture, they'll capture back, and now we can fix the weakness, right? This c4 pawn is a doubled pawn, and it is something that we can target. So immediately, I like to move pawn to c5. If they ever take, then that is completely fine with us. We'll just capture back. They still have the same problems on the c-file. The best move according to the engine is actually knight to d2, which is not the most intuitive to bring it back. In that case, we'll play knight c6, and then they'll probably fianchetto, and we're pretty much out of the opening here. All you have to do is get your queen off the back rank, black's rooks are connected, and in the meantime of that, we have that long-term idea we mentioned of playing the knight to a5, bishop to a6, and we have a really good position against white's setup. But notice how this is very different than your traditional Queen's Gambit. So perhaps the player with white isn't really getting the comfortable position that they would be used to. But now let's go back here because we don't have to have them play the normal e3. You might ask yourself, what other moves could white play? There are actually many in this main line opening. We have already looked at e3, what we would do, and which involves playing b6. So let's take a look at queen c2, the classical line. Against queen c2, I actually like pawn c5 right away. And we're not quite doubling their pawns yet because of course their queen can recapture. Now if they ever take our pawn, we don't necessarily have to capture back. I actually like castling first, and then giving them the extra option to see what they do. Very often white will kind of be a little impatient, and they'll play a3, trying to get rid of the bishop. And in that case, then I'll just bring the bishop back, capture on c5, material is equal, and we have a really good position here. Maybe we can try and play for pawn to d5, or maybe we can even fianchetto, and then we're even supporting d5. And again, we are also keeping very important control over the e4 square. But perhaps they might not play queen c2. What if they play pawn to a3? Well, a3 is actually really easy for us. We'll just capture the knight that we wanted to capture anyway. They capture back. And now I actually just like castling. Still in the opening principles are important. They'll probably play e3 to develop their light scored bishop. And now we can go for b6. They'll develop their bishop, we fianchetto. And now we're looking at the g2 pawn. And now I would actually just play c5 here. Already trying to blockade the weakness here. We'll probably play knight to c6, knight a5, bishop to a6. We're putting a lot of pressure on this pawn. Now what if they ignore our bishop and they just play knight to f3 instead? Well, in this case we still play pawn to b6. They develop their bishop. We can capture here. In this case they don't have to accept the doubled pawns. The bishop can actually recapture to keep their pawn structure. But then we'll just fianchetto anyway. And now the knight that used to be here is no longer controlling this e4 square. And so we've actually gained very important control over this square. So now they'll play e3, and because that square is weak, we can actually land our knight here on e4. And if we really wanted to long term, we might even be able to support it with pawn to f5. But even that move is not really necessary, as the knight here is just really not attacked by anything. And once again, black actually has a good position and really good play. But now let's get to a trickier option. Let's say our opponent for white is actually somewhat well prepared of our b6 idea. Well, one idea they might try is to fianchetto their own bishop first. They'll probably start with pawn to g3. And the idea is that we now don't want to play b6 because they'll fianchetto first. And now I can't put my bishop here because then they'll just capture our bishop. So in this case, I would just start with knight to c6. Kind of like an interference idea where we can get our bishop to b7 safely. They'll fianchetto. We double their pawns first. Then we play b6. They'll try and grab the center. But now we don't need to necessarily go for the fianchetto, because unlike before where their bishop was now defending this pawn is no longer defended. And try and highlight this weakness by just going to a6 in one move, and we've actually kind of saved ourselves a move. White was trying to trick us by the fianchetto and get to that diagonal first, and now they might regret their bishop being on the wrong diagonal. The only really good way that I can see that you can defend this is playing queen to a5. And in that case, we'll just go after this pawn immediately. Remember, our plan was usually get the knight here and here anyway. And so in this case, we actually just continue with our plan. And in doing so, we've stopped the queen from attacking our bishop. And it's actually very difficult for white here to play against black with their doubled pawns. Now, if white is really worried of this whole setup that we have for black, it's a very simple setup, but extremely effective as well. And so if they're really worried of this, they might try and avoid playing knight c3 because they don't want that knight to get pinned. And so instead, they may play the Anti-Nimzo-Indian, which is knight to f3, with the intention that if we ever give a check here, they can probably just block. And then if we trade or not, they have kept their knight, and they're not getting the doubled pawns. So we don't need to walk into their plan. We can continue with our b6 idea. And if they just continue developing normally, then we'll just fianchetto, once again controlling this important e4 square. So why do I recommend this Nimzo-Indian defense? Well, the reason is actually because it's very straightforward. It's a really effective plan against white's chosen setup, and the ideas are pretty easy to learn. As you may have noticed, it's the same concepts over and over. We're very often playing for b6, we're playing with very good opening principles, and we're just going after these doubled pawns once they get doubled. And I just want to talk very generally about this entire opening. So in this case, if white wants to generate any kind of play in this opening, white has to be very active in doing so. Very often, this queen is going to go to c2. They're going to try and put pressure on black's king. So why do they have to be so active? They have to be active because positionally, if we ever go into an endgame, if things start trading off the board, all the pieces come off, it's going to benefit black because here, white has doubled pawns and black does not. And so this is a static weakness. This is not going anywhere anytime soon. And so basically, white has to play aggressively to black's king and try and checkmate us in the middle game. Because if they get to an endgame, this is going to be a liability to them. Now, black's plan is a little bit different. Because black's plan says that we have all the time in the world, we just have to stop white from checkmating us, basically. And if we go into an endgame, that's fine. But even if we keep the game in the middle game, this idea against this pawn is very straightforward. And white might very easily get tied down trying to defend that. And I will show a lot more here, but there's a ton of mainline theory that you can learn. So grandmasters play these kind of positions all the time. Nimzo-Indian Defense is a very popular opening. But I thought more important than showing a bunch of highly theoretical lines is to simply show the key ideas, mainly controlling the e4 square, and mainly the fact that this fianchetto or bishop to a6, going after this pawn here in coordination with the knight, are actually very common ideas that happen in all of these lines. If black just knows these very few ideas, and they keep emphasis on opening principles, getting castled early, which we've done, fighting for the center, which they might get with d6 or d5 at some point, or just continuing to develop pieces, something like, say, queen to c7. In all of those cases, black will be doing really well. Try taking a look at this opening. It might be the opening that you're looking for to start winning some more of those games. Thanks for stopping by, everyone. I'll see you in the next chess video.